In this video, we're going to take a look at a very important topic in project management, which is scheduling. Why is scheduling important? I think that kind of goes without saying. If we consider the triple constraint of project management, we remember there's time, cost, and scope. Pick any two. So in other words, you can get something done quickly with low budget, but there's not going to be a whole lot of scope. Or you can get something done with a lot of scope and a little budget, but it's going to take a lot of time. And there's a dynamic there where if we try to go for all three, we won't get all three, but instead we'll end up sacrificing quality. With time being one of the three constraints, it naturally follows that scheduling is something that a project manager wants to pay close attention to. So there are several techniques that we can use here, and we'll take a look at several of these. So critical path is where we look at the activities in a project plan that can't be delayed, or if they are delayed, it will impact that final delivery date. Resource optimization is looking at ways we can make the best use of the resources we have. And then there's several ways that we can model what a project will look like. Anywhere from data modeling all the way up to a Monte Carlo simulation or something like that. I think probably the first two that you see here are the ones you're going to see the most often or use on a day-to-day basis as a project manager. At least knowing what the critical path is and knowing how to effectively plan for resources. A few things we can consider as project managers is the need for reserves, which comes in two flavors. Contingency reserves, which are for, okay, things ran a little bit behind, and then also management reserves, which are for unknown unknowns. So for building a very large project and it's using leading edge technology, there are certain things that we simply won't know about until the time comes to work on them. Another thing that we as project managers can do is take a look at the critical path. We want to watch that path very closely and look for any activities on that path that are high risk or have a high number of unknowns. We want to put those up towards the top of the things that we're considering or monitoring every day. As a matter of fact, one technique in Scrum is to have a special sprint board called a RAID board. That's for risks, assumptions, issues, and dependencies. And it's just those things we want to keep an eye on and we don't want to fall off our list. And so many times if there's something on the critical path that's high risk, we'll want to keep our eyes on that regularly versus something that's maybe this font is not gray enough. That's not as important as maybe we need to get the APIs aligned and we need to have them all come together and be used in our mobile application, or we need to have accessibility or internationalization or any of those things that are considered must-haves before we release an application. So the critical path method we've talked about quite a bit, and will continue to talk about. So what is a critical path anyway? Well, think about a large project with several people working on it, maybe a team of people, maybe even multiple teams. Many times we'll parallelize activities so that this group over here can be working on this, maybe the API, this group's working on the front end, this other group is working on accessibility. So we'll have multiple tasks running in parallel. Now the critical path is the longest path of activities through the project once we've broken them up into these effectively parallel tracks. So the longest path means that everything else has an opportunity to either start late or finish early except for these things on the critical path. And that effectively says this is the shortest time you'll be able to get the project done. In other words, if the critical path, if you add up all the days on it and it's maybe 3 months, then you'll say, okay, well the project cannot be delivered any sooner than 3 months, because if so, we'd be in a situation where we would not be able to complete that critical path. So if we think non-critical path activities, then we have several options here that we can calculate. One is an early start. So let's say that our critical path activity is going to take maybe 20 days. We have a non-critical path activity that's going to take 10. We could either start that on the very first day of the project, or we could start that when there are 10 days to go. So if we started on the first day, that would be an early start. If we start it when there are 10 days to go before the project is ready, or 10 days to go on the critical path, that would be called the late start date. Similarly, if we start early and end early, well then we have an early finish date. If we start late and end late, not necessarily late, but the latest we can without affecting the critical path or the project itself, Then we have our late start and our late finish date. These are probably easiest to look at through an example, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. But first, I want to talk a little bit about float. So float is closely related to that concept of early start and late start, because I mentioned critical path is 20 days, another parallel track is 10 days. Well, then that means we have 10 days of float. So if we know that the critical path can't be any shorter than 20, but we have 10 that we can move around anytime in that period, 10 days of work, that leaves 10 other days when we can float back and forth. Maybe a little easier if I use a different number. Let's say the critical path is 20 days. Our activity is going to take 5 days, and it's not on the critical path. It's a parallel track of work without any other dependencies. Then the time for that task is 5 days. The float would be 15 days. It gets a little more complicated when we do have dependencies both before a task and after a task. Then we get into a conversation of free float, but hold that thought. Let's master float first. So positive total float means we take a look at the project end date. We calculate all of the activities that are required for that. We look at the dependencies across those activities. And we have extra days available to us before the project needs to be delivered. So that would be positive total float. Now, negative total float means we have, say, project is supposed to be delivered June 1. Right now it's May 1. We have 45 days of work to do, say, on our critical path. Then we have 15 days of negative float because, as the schedule goes, we have 30 days to do work and 45 days of work to do. So if that's the case, it's good to find this information early and communicate the information early, because you have a lot more levers you can pull. You have a lot more options early on if that bad news is delivered. One is to try to negotiate a later delivery date for the project, but another one might be looking at ways we can optimize resources, looking at ways we can maybe borrow resources from another group, a lot of things that we can do to try to make it right. What I advise not doing is just kind of saying, well, looks like we have 15 days of total float, but I bet we'll make that up between now and then. Don't go on a hunch. Don't go on an assumption. These things do tend to snowball. So with all that, let's try our hand at calculating a few of these metrics, this early start, late finish, so on and so forth. We start with this example or this project, and you see that we have a series of activities with simply an activity letter. And then we have a number of days to complete the activity. Now, the math gets just a little bit tricky here because we assume full days of work. So activity A, for example, is 5 days. We assume that's 5 days start to finish. That means if we start on day 1, that's a full day of work. Day 2, day 3, day 4, and then day 5. At the end of day 5, that task is complete. So we start at the beginning of day 1. We finish at the end of day 5, and that gives us a total of 5 days. What I caution here is you say, well, we start day 1. It took 5 days to do. 5 plus 1 is 6, so it's going to end on day 6. Not really. It's going to end at the end of day 5, and the next activity can start at the beginning of day 6. So just a little careful there when you're doing the math. You see the arrows here set up a dependency chain that say, okay, activity B and C cannot start until activity A is finished. And with this, we can see it's fairly easy to calculate a critical path here because we look at all the paths through this project, and we have one path, which is ACF, and that's a total of 13 days. We have another path that is ABDF, which is 15 days. And then we have yet another path, which is EF, which has no dependency on A. And that's 9 days. So we can see that the critical path here is the longest path, the ABDF path, which is 15 days. So given that, we know there's zero float there, there's zero slack there, assuming that this is a 15-day project. But we can compute the early start, early finish, and late finish for the non-critical path activities. So let's give it a try. First of all, activity A, since this is critical path, there is no early start or late start. it simply is going to start on day 1 and end on day 5, with the note that I have earlier that we consider day 1 to be a full working day. We start in the morning, the beginning of the day, and then we end at the end of day 5. So, that pretty much makes sense for a critical path activity. And then given the critical path, we can add that the project will finish on day 15. Now, let's consider activity C. And this one can get just a little bit tricky. So if we take a look at activity C, okay, we know its prerequisite is A, and then it must be finished for F to start. So effectively, activity C is running parallel to B and D. So B and D is 5 days, C is 3 days. That gives us 2 days of float. You see, we can just kind of look at this in isolation and compute that that is its own parallel path. And up here we have 2 days of float. How soon can we start C? Well, remember that A is going to finish at the end of day 5, which means C can start at the beginning of day 6. And then if C goes for 3 days, once again, we have to remember 6 is a full working day, 7 is a full working day, 8 is a full working day. It's going to finish at the end of day 8. Now, how soon can activity F start? Well, this is 5 days. This is another 5 days. Activity F can't start until the beginning of day 11. So if we finish at day 8, that gives us day 9 and 10 as float, which is 2 days of float. Okay, now what about our late start day? Well, if activity F cannot begin until the beginning of day 11, we know that activity C has to be finished by the end of day 10. And if activity C takes 3 days, and we do those days in order, then that's going to be day number 10 will be the last, then day number 9, then day number 8. 3 full days, 8, 9, 10. So that gives us a late start of 8 and a late finish of 10. See how we did? Early start day 6, late start day 8, early finish day 8, but there again, remember the end of day 8, not the beginning. Late finish day 10, and total float of 2. Okay, so we were able to compute it there. Now let's consider activity E, which is a bit of an interesting one, because E simply has to finish before F starts. We know F is going to start on the morning of day 11. So E needs to be finished by the end of day 10. But aside from that, there are no other constraints here. It's running parallel to the critical path. It's running parallel to the A, B, D lane of the critical path, which is 10 days. Activity E is 4 days. That gives us 6 days of float. It gives us a late finish of day 10. And then if we need 4 working days, that would be 10, 9, 8, 7, which would give us a late start of day 7. Now, early start is simply the first day of the project, because we could start activity E at any time. So we could start it on day 1, then day 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 working days. Early finish would be day 4. Let's see how we did. Early start day 1, early finish day 4, late start day 7, late finish day 10. Total float is 10 minus 4, which is going to give us 6. Let's take a look at this, and since we've had a little experience with critical path, let's try to figure out what the critical path is here. Well, gosh, we have several parallel activities going. So we'll start left to right. We know that we have this activity F here, and off of that are 2 parallel paths that are prerequisite. AB is a total of 8 days, CDE is a total of 10. Okay. So right now the total of 10 days is looking like the longest path is obviously 10 is greater than 8, 10 plus 8. But then we also have to consider, okay, total of 18 days, by the way. We also have to consider that's a prerequisite for activity J. So is activity G. Okay, so A, D, E, F is effectively running in parallel with G. Whichever of those takes the longer time will be the critical path. We know that A, D, E, F is 18 days. G is 9 days. 18 is greater than 9, so A, C, D, F so far is going to be our critical path. Now it gets a little bit easier at this point because we've established this is the critical path. G is not. Now we have put 2 parallel tracks here again, but given that we've rolled out G as being part of the critical path, we know that H and J both have the same prerequisite. So there it's simply a matter of which item takes longer to complete, and it's J. So J is going to be on our critical path. And then our final activity, K, will also be on our critical path. So, final computation, there we go. That's our critical path. Now, some considerations here. When I took a class in project management back, I believe it was year 2000, that was really before Scrum and Agile were a thing, and we tended to learn things with Waterfall, and we tended to spend a lot of time on critical path. And my thinking at the time was, if you have a choice, early start is a better idea than late start, because then that gives you a bit more flexibility. I still see merit in that. But I will say in practice, two things. First of all, you typically don't have that luxury. Typically, when you're managing a project, resources tend to be allocated, if not over-allocated, and you're doing your best to get things started by the late start date. But is that necessarily a problem? Not really. Not necessarily, or maybe I should really say not always. Reason being, think about just-in-time, which was a big buzzword in the 90s and still to some degree is today. Just-in-time inventory management means that you don't want to have warehouses full of inventory. Consumer needs change, and you might find that you no longer need all that inventory. I think about a professor I had in undergrad who's started a business making orange hula hoops until he got a bunch of orange hula hoops returned from retailers, and he said, what am I supposed to do with all this orange plastic I have sitting around? And the retailer said, well, nobody's buying orange hula hoops anymore. So the more orange hula hoops that you have, if suddenly needs change and people don't like orange hula hoops anymore, the more you have to get rid of. Similar with software. Do you want to build software and have it sitting on a shelf for a long time? Probably not too long. Because, first of all, people change teams, and the person who wrote that might be on another team. And knowledge atrophies. The person who wrote that might forget why they wrote it. And the reality is priorities change. So if you're building too much stuff in advance, and then that project gets canceled, you've done a lot of work that's not going to end up being used. So bottom line, do you prefer early start or late start? I've kind of given good reasons for both, and the real reason is it depends. Both have their advantages, either having the work done and having a bit of slack time, or doing the work just in time and being able to adapt to needs as opposed to having software that you're going to need to throw away. So that's a look at critical path. In our next video, we will take a look at resource optimization. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.